I never thought I'd find myself in a war with my own neighborhood, but looking back, should have seen it coming from the day I moved in. The subdivision looked peaceful from the outside, rows of neatly trimmed lawns, pastel-colored houses with identical driveways, and that little white sign at the entrance that read, Meadowbrook Estates, a community that cares. The irony of those words burns in my memory now. Because the truth was, Meadowbrook didn't care about people like me. It cared about rules, about control, and most of all, about the whims of the HOA board and the woman who ruled it like a queen on her throne, Margaret Maggie Wilkins. Everyone called her Karen behind her back, and believe me, she earned that title in every way possible. When I bought my house on Hawthorne Lane, I was looking for peace and stability. I had spent years grinding away at my engineering job, saving every penny, and finally, I was ready to settle down. My house wasn't the biggest on the block, but it had a wide driveway, a small patch of oak trees, and enough room for me to finally build the workshop I'd always dreamed of. I had plans, real plans, to fix up an old classic car in my spare time, maybe even build furniture once I retired. It felt like a dream, one I had worked my whole life to achieve. What I didn't realize at the time was that the HOA would do everything in its power to make that dream miserable. The first couple of months were quiet enough. Sure, I received a few letters, reminders about keeping my trash can hidden from street view or ensuring my mailbox met the community's aesthetic standards. They were annoying, but I didn't think much of it. Every neighborhood had rules, right? I just went along, kept my head down, and tried not to make waves. But Maggie, oh, she had a way of sniffing out anyone who didn't bow to her authority. And the more I ignored her, the more determined she became to prove that she could control me. The real trouble began when I bought my second truck. It wasn't anything fancy, just a used Ford F-250 I needed for work projects. But the day I parked it in my own driveway, I swear Maggie was watching from behind her curtains like a hawk. The next morning, I found a citation taped to my front door: oversized vehicles are not permitted to be stored in driveways. Please move your truck to an off-site facility or face fines. I laughed at first, thinking it had to be some kind of mistake. But when I tried to reason with her, Maggie stood there in her floral dress, arms crossed, and told me flat out, "We don't want this neighborhood looking like a construction yard. Rules are rules." I should have walked away right then. I reminded her that I paid my mortgage, my taxes, and my dues just like everyone else. But all that got me was a smirk and another warning in the mail. From that day forward, it was war. Maggie found new reasons to target me every week. My grass was half an inch too tall. My shed door needed repainting. My Christmas lights weren't uniform enough. I even got a warning because a single fallen leaf sat too long on my lawn after a storm. It was harassment, plain and simple, but I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me quit. I did my best to comply, but she wanted more, she wanted submission. And the more I resisted, the more aggressive her tactics became. Then came the day that changed everything, the day they blocked my driveway. I had been out running errands, picking up lumber for my workshop project, but when I got out of my truck, I saw the laminated sign zip-tied to one of the cones: HOA notice, driveway access temporarily revoked pending compliance review. My blood boiled. They hadn't even given me notice. No call, no letter, nothing. Just 2 cones and a sign telling me I wasn't allowed to use my own damn driveway. I ripped the sign down, tossed the cones into the yard, and stormed into the HOA office at the clubhouse. Maggie was sitting there, sipping her iced tea like nothing was wrong. "You blocked my driveway," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "It's for the good of the community," she replied sweetly, without even looking up. "Until you remove that workshop structure you're building, we cannot allow you to use the driveway. It's against the aesthetic covenant." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My workshop wasn't even finished. It wasn't visible from the street. And more importantly, it was mine. My property. But in Maggie's twisted little world, none of that mattered. She thought she owned me because she controlled the board. I left that office with my fists clenched and my jaw tight, but instead of lashing out, I decided to think. I've always been a planner. An engineer doesn't just react, he calculates, measures, and designs solutions. And that night, as I sat at my kitchen table staring at that stupid violation notice, an idea sparked in my mind, an idea so outrageous, so petty, and yet so perfectly legal, that I knew it would hit the HOA where it hurt most. See, what Maggie and the rest of the board didn't realize was that I had done my homework when I bought the house. I knew every detail about the easements, the property lines, and even the ownership of the road that ran through our neighborhood. Most people assumed it was an HOA-maintained private road. But it wasn't. The actual ownership still technically belonged to me, part of a weird clerical oversight when the subdivision was first developed. I had rights to that little strip of asphalt in front of my house, and with those rights, I had power. Power that Maggie had just given me a reason to use. For the next week, I played along. I parked my truck on the street. I waved politely at the board members who drove by, pretending like I had accepted my punishment. But inside, I was drafting contracts, making calls, and meeting with city officials. I presented them with a simple proposal: purchase the stretch of road running past my property. It wasn't large, just a single lane connecting two cul-de-sacs, but it was enough. Enough for the city to take over maintenance, to enforce traffic laws, and most importantly, to override any HOA authority on that strip. When the deal was signed, I felt a rush of satisfaction like nothing I'd ever experienced. The very next morning, city workers rolled in with new signage: public road, no parking without permit. They painted fresh white lines, installed a resident parking by city permit only sign, and left a little box of permits in my mailbox. Just like that, my driveway access was no longer under HOA control. Maggie couldn't touch it. But the best part? The city enforced parking rules with brutal efficiency. And within a week, half the board members had racked up tickets for leaving their cars in front of my house. Maggie herself got a $200 citation for blocking the new public access lane during her garden party. The look on her face when she realized what I'd done was priceless, like someone had yanked the crown right off her head. That was the moment I knew I had won the first battle. It was only the opening shot, and though it hit Maggie right where it hurt, it also lit a fire in her that burned hotter than ever. The day after she got that ticket for parking in front of my property, she showed up at my door with her little entourage of HOA board members trailing behind her like soldiers marching into battle. They had clipboards, folded papers, and expressions so smug you'd think they were about to evict me on the spot. I didn't even bother to invite them in. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, and let them talk. And if the community's mad, maybe they should be mad at you for provoking me in the first place. Her face turned red, the kind of red that makes you think steam might actually shoot out of someone's ears. But she recovered quickly, flipping through her stack of papers. We've reviewed your property again, and you're in violation of at least 7 different HOA covenants. Your shed is too large. Your fence is an unapproved color. Your grass is uneven. And don't think we haven't noticed that you're using your garage as a workshop. That is strictly prohibited under Article 14 of our guidelines. The board members nodded like trained parrots, each one muttering about how important it was to maintain standards. I just stood there, listening, letting them dig their hole deeper. When she finally shoved the stack of violation notices into my hands, I didn't even flinch. "Thanks," I said. "I'll add these to my collection." Then I shut the door in their faces. I could hear Maggie screaming outside, threatening to fine me, to lien my property, to drag me into court if I didn't comply. But here's the thing, I had already anticipated this. I knew she would double down, and I had been preparing for it. Every single violation notice she handed me, I already had a lawyer on retainer ready to challenge them. And not just any lawyer, I hired the kind of guy who lived for tearing apart HOAs. He was expensive, sure, but I considered it an investment. The first time Maggie tried to slap me with a fine for the oversized shed, my lawyer responded with a 30-page rebuttal, citing state property laws, case precedents, and even environmental ordinances that technically made my shed more compliant than half the houses in the neighborhood. The board was stunned. They weren't used to anyone fighting back, let alone dismantling their arguments piece by piece. But Maggie wasn't done. She called for an emergency board meeting, dragging every neighbor into the clubhouse to vote on new rules, rules that were clearly designed just to target me. They proposed banning non-standard driveway activities, outlawing mechanical work within visible structures, and even restricting any resale or reassignment of neighborhood roads. That last one made me laugh out loud when I heard it. Too little, too late. Still, I went to the meeting. I sat quietly in the back, listening as Maggie gave her fiery speech about how I was destroying the character of Meadowbrook and setting a dangerous precedent that could ruin property values. She waved her arms like a preacher in church, whipping the crowd into a frenzy. Some neighbors nodded along, but others just looked uncomfortable. I moved here because I wanted a home. I pay my dues, I keep my property in order, and I follow the same rules as all of you. But the difference is, I won't be bullied. The HOA doesn't own me. Maggie doesn't own me. And if you think your property values are at risk, maybe you should ask why one person gets to abuse power and create conflict for the whole neighborhood. The room went silent. For the first time, I saw Maggie's confidence crack. People were whispering, some even nodding in agreement. She quickly tried to regain control, calling for a vote, but the numbers weren't on her side anymore. Code enforcement officers started showing up at my property, clearly tipped off by anonymous complaints. A city inspector came by twice in 1 week, citing supposed noise disturbances from my workshop, even though I hadn't even turned on a power tool that week. My mailbox was mysteriously knocked over one morning. A neighbor I barely knew suddenly accused me of harassing him, claiming I shouted profanities at his family from my yard. All lies, of course, but lies backed by Maggie's whisper campaign. I documented everything. Every citation, every false complaint, every incident. My lawyer advised me to stay calm, to gather evidence, because the more she pushed, the stronger my case would become. And he was right. But Maggie's real masterpiece of pettiness came when she rallied her allies to park their cars along the public road in front of my house. They thought they were clever, filling every available space so I'd have nowhere to park my truck. What they didn't realize was that the road was now city property, and the city enforced residential permits strictly. I made one quick call, and within an hour, a tow truck rolled in and hauled off 4 of their cars. I sat on my porch sipping coffee while Maggie's friends screamed at the tow driver, waving their arms like maniacs. It was glorious. Of course, that incident only deepened the divide in the neighborhood. On one side were Maggie's loyalists, the ones who believed every word she spewed about me being a troublemaker. On the other side were the quiet majority, the folks who were tired of her drama and starting to see me as the underdog fighting back. Some even stopped by to shake my hand, thanking me for standing up to her. One older gentleman, Mr. Peterson, told me, "Son, I've lived here 15 years, and no one's had the guts to do what you're doing. Don't stop now." Their support gave me strength. It wasn't just about me anymore, it was about breaking Maggie's chokehold on the entire community. And as much as I wanted peace, I realized the only way to get it was to dismantle her power completely. The final straw came when I received a letter not from the HOA, but from Maggie's personal attorney. She was threatening to sue me for defamation of character, because I had publicly undermined her authority at the board meeting. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The woman had no shame. But instead of ignoring it, I decided to escalate. I dug deeper into the HOA's financial records I had requested legally under homeowner rights. What I found was jaw-dropping. Misused funds. Unapproved expenses. Thousands of dollars spent on landscaping that never happened, maintenance on facilities that didn't exist, and personal reimbursement signed off by Maggie herself. It was corruption, plain and simple. And now I had the smoking gun. I called my lawyer. "It's time," I said. We drafted a formal complaint, not just to the HOA, but to the State Attorney General's office. We attached all the evidence, every shady transaction, every violation of fiduciary duty. And while we waited for the hammer to fall, I started preparing the neighborhood for the storm. Quietly, I shared the information with a few trusted neighbors. Word spread fast. Within days, the same people who once cowered under Maggie's rule were demanding answers. The war had reached a boiling point. Maggie wasn't just fighting me anymore, she was fighting an entire neighborhood that was waking up to the truth. And deep down, I knew she had no idea how much further I was willing to go to make sure she never held power over me, or anyone else, again. The weeks that followed were like living in the middle of a brewing storm, quiet at moments, but tense, with the air thick and charged like lightning was about to strike. Maggie had always strutted around Meadowbrook Estates with the unshakable confidence of a queen who believed her crown was welded to her head. But after my complaint reached the State Attorney General's office, her composure began to crack. They didn't announce it with sirens or flashing lights, but word travels fast in a small community, and everyone knew what it meant when two men in suits showed up at the clubhouse carrying briefcases. I was working in my workshop when Mr. Peterson came jogging over, out of breath, grinning like a kid who just witnessed the school bully trip over her shoelaces. "They're in there grilling her right now," he whispered. "Asking for receipts, records, everything." I walked down the street casually, pretending I was just heading to my mailbox, and sure enough, through the glass doors of the clubhouse, I saw Maggie sitting stiffly at the conference table, her arms crossed tight across her chest. The auditors were flipping through folders, pointing at numbers, their faces growing more and more serious. A few other board members sat beside her, pale and nervous, clearly realizing that whatever was happening was way bigger than some petty feud about a driveway. By the end of that week, the whispers had turned into open conversations. Neighbors were stopping me on the sidewalk, asking if it was true that Maggie had been funneling HOA money into personal expenses. I never lied, but I didn't spread details either. "Just wait and see," I told them. "The truth has a way of coming out." And oh, did it ever. The auditor's preliminary findings leaked, and they were explosive. Maggie had been reimbursing herself for volunteer hours, essentially paying herself thousands of dollars for the privilege of bossing everyone around. She had charged landscaping bills to the HOA for her personal garden, and maintenance bills for her own house disguised as community upgrades. Worst of all, she had dipped into the HOA's reserve funds, money meant for emergencies and long-term repairs, to finance what looked like an extravagant vacation to the Bahamas. There were credit card receipts, flight records, the whole paper trail. The neighborhood went from quiet grumbling to outright revolt overnight. Homeowners who had once avoided making eye contact with me were suddenly showing up at my door, thanking me for taking her on. Some even asked me to run for the board when elections came around. It was surreal, me, the man who had been branded the community troublemaker, now being seen as the one person who had stood up and exposed the rot. Maggie, of course, fought back. She called an emergency HOA meeting, insisting she was the victim of a smear campaign. She claimed the receipts were taken out of context, that the reimbursements were approved expenses, that the vacation was actually a conference about community leadership. But this time, no one was buying it. Even her most loyal allies sat stone-faced, unwilling to stick their necks out for her. I attended the meeting, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I wanted to make sure the truth stayed front and center. When she accused me directly of orchestrating everything, I stood up slowly, holding a folder in my hand. Maggie, the only thing I orchestrated was turning over evidence to the proper authorities. The rest? That's your signature on those checks. Your credit card number on those receipts. Your name on the reservation at that beachfront resort. I placed copies of the documents on the table for everyone to see. The silence in the room was deafening. Her face drained of color, then flushed red again as she sputtered excuses. But the damage was done. The board voted unanimously to suspend her pending the outcome of the investigation. For the first time since I'd moved into Meadowbrook Estates, the HOA had no queen. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, and for a week or two, that's exactly what it felt like. People smiled more. Kids rode their bikes freely without Maggie scolding them for disturbing the peace. Even the mailman joked that the neighborhood felt lighter. But power doesn't give up so easily. Maggie wasn't the kind of person to slink away quietly into the night. No, she still had claws, and even stripped of her title, she wasn't afraid to use them. It started with the small stuff again. Anonymous letters slipped into my mailbox calling me a traitor. Trash mysteriously dumped on my lawn overnight. A dead patch of grass on my side yard that I later discovered was caused by someone pouring salt into the soil. These were petty acts, the desperate flailing of someone who had lost her grip. But they were also reminders that the war wasn't truly over. Then came the lawsuits. Maggie filed one against me personally for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Another against the city for unlawful seizure of community property when they purchased the road. Both were laughable in their lack of merit, but they forced me to spend time and money on legal responses. My lawyer was calm about it, he'd seen worse. She's trying to bleed you dry, make you fold from exhaustion, he said. But I wasn't folding. Not now. In fact, I decided to go further. If Maggie wanted to drag this into the courts, then so be it. I filed my own countersuit for harassment, defamation, and intentional property damage. I had the evidence, after all, photos, videos, written records. And I had neighbors willing to testify. People who had seen her dumping trash on my lawn. People, she would show up to court in gaudy suits, waving her arms and shouting about conspiracies, about how I was destroying the fabric of the neighborhood. The judges, of course, were unmoved. The evidence spoke louder than her theatrics. Slowly but surely, the scales tipped further in my favor. The climax came when the state finally issued their ruling on the HOA investigation. Maggie was permanently barred from holding any position of authority within a homeowners association. She was ordered to repay nearly $50,000 in misused funds. And though she managed to avoid criminal charges by the skin of her teeth, the humiliation was complete. She was disgraced, stripped of her power, and broke. The neighborhood erupted in celebration. Some threw backyard parties. Others simply smiled and waved as I drove past, their faces lit. But here's the thing, victory didn't taste as sweet as I thought it would. Don't get me wrong, it felt damn good to see Maggie finally get what she deserved. But the fight had taken a toll. My workshop sat half-finished for months because I was too busy battling in court. My savings had taken a hit from legal fees. And while I had won, I knew deep down that people like Maggie never really disappear. They just wait, plotting their next move. I told myself I'd be ready. That if she ever tried to crawl back out of the shadows, I'd crush her again without hesitation. But little did I know, the next round of this war wasn't going to come from Maggie directly. It was going to come from something bigger, something that would shake the entire neighborhood to its core. Because the city, now that it owned the road, had plans for it. And those plans were about to make Maggie look like nothing more than a warm-up act. The moment the city officially owned the road, what I hadn't fully accounted for was how many other people, not just Maggie and her cronies, had designs on that thin strip of asphalt. City planners are like ants when they sniff an opportunity, they swarm, they evaluate, they redistribute. Within weeks of the transfer, a polite but firm letter arrived from the Department of Public Works explaining that the city had accepted responsibility for the road and that a routine survey would be conducted to assess needed repairs, drainage, and safety improvements. At first I thought, good, potholes fixed, proper lighting, maybe even a crosswalk so Mrs. Alvarez's kids wouldn't have to dash across the street to the bus stop. But the benign language in that letter masked the real talk that happened behind closed doors, the kind that finds its way into planning commission agendas and developer briefs. A developer with a slick brochure and an even slicker smile showed up at the next civic meeting, slides clicking through a PowerPoint about connectivity and smart growth. He talked about widening the road by a lane or two, adding a bike path, and zoning allowances that would permit denser housing on the far side of the cul-de-sac, townhomes advertised as luxury infill, that would allegedly increase property values for everyone. My skin crawled. It didn't take a genius to see how a widened road and a new cluster of townhomes could turn our quiet cul-de-sacs into a through-route, increasing traffic, noise, and the very thing Maggie had always claimed to be protecting us from, except now it was being sold as progress. People split into camps faster than I could count fences. Some neighbors, fresh from their victory over the HOA corruption, trusted the city and the developers' glossy renderings. They imagined better curb appeal, a few more dollars on their resale value, and less responsibility for potholes and snowplows. Others, the ones who loved the slow, quiet sweep of morning sunlight across their porches and the privacy of cul-de-sac life, recoiled at the thought of construction dumpsters and the hum of new HVAC units 5 houses away. Mr. Peterson, who'd become something of an unlikely ally to me, called it a Trojan horse. He'd seen cities promise the moon and deliver a traffic nightmare. Once the bulldozers roll in, he said one evening on my porch, you can't unring that bell. That's when the meeting started. The Planning Commission scheduled a public hearing, and the room at City Hall filled up with the kind of tension that makes your palms sweat. I didn't want to be the loudest voice in the room, I wanted to be the smartest, so I showed up armed with binders, traffic studies I'd requested, historical property maps, citizen petitions, and the outline of an alternative plan I'd drafted with a civil engineer I'd hired. Yes, I'd hired people. When you poke a hornet's nest you better have friends who know how to squish hornets without getting stung. My proposal was simple, keep the road but maintain it as a low-impact residential way with traffic calming measures, speed humps, narrowed lanes, enhanced pedestrian crossings, and a protected fund for maintenance that the city would contribute to only if a supermajority of homeowners approved any future rezoning. It was legal, practical, and politically palatable. Best of all, it didn't require swapping our quiet for a highway. The developer's lawyer called my plan naive. Cities have to plan for growth, he said, voice smooth as lacquer. Denying progress isn't the answer. He patted the glossy renderings as if they were holy tablets. But when the microphone opened for public comment, the room erupted with testimony from people who described what our neighborhood actually meant to them: dinners on back porches, late-night stargazing, kids learning to ride bikes without fear. They talked about the trees that shaded the street and the rhythm of the neighborhood that couldn't be captured on a brochure. I watched several homeowners who had once bowed to Maggie stand up and speak with a newfound confidence that steadied my own heart. The hearing extended late into the night, and when the Planning Commission adjourned, they promised to study both proposals and come back with a recommendation. In the weeks that followed, there were more surveys, more meetings, and, predictably, more pressure tactics. The developer quietly funded a flurry of mailers showing smiling families and annotated projections of rising home values. Someone, who would later be traced back to a consulting firm the developer had hired, began calling elderly neighbors at dinner, planting subtle doubts about whether our resistance would leave us left behind. Meanwhile, some of the residents who supported development were pressured by promises of infrastructure improvements, better sewer lines, more frequent trash pickup, things that disproportionately appealed to residents tired of dealing with a patchwork of old systems. The schism in the neighborhood hardened like concrete. I felt lonely in a way I hadn't since Maggie's first volley of petty citations. This was bigger, systemic, and harder to fight purely on principle. So I shifted tactics. I organized. Instead of treating every meeting like a showdown, I built a coalition. I met with small groups of neighbors for coffee in their dining rooms, for lemonade on hot afternoons in the park, and for quiet walks where we talked about everything from bus routes to the placement of stop signs. We formed a neighborhood committee, electing a small steering group that would communicate with the city and provide a united front. We hired a traffic analyst to model different scenarios, showing how a widened road would increase peak speeds and create cut-through traffic that would slice through residential streets. We requested an environmental impact assessment, pointing out that several of our mature trees were on a protected list and that their removal would be a significant ecological loss. Each document we produced made it harder for the developer to claim his plan was merely community-friendly growth. But the developer had money and, more importantly, access. He presented at the county level and lobbied planners who had been briefed by glossy consultants. He dangled the magic word that often shifts civic debates: jobs. Construction jobs, local contractors, increased tax revenues, his lobbyist would say, and those words cut through the idealism of our arguments with surgical precision. Several council members shifted their posture slightly, not overtly against us, but suddenly more interested in the economic modeling and less in sentimental visions of porch swings and quiet cul-de-sacs. I couldn't begrudge them for their duty. Cities must balance growth with preservation. But I also couldn't let them forget there are neighborhoods that aren't just assets on a spreadsheet, they are homes. When the Planning Commission finally made its preliminary recommendation, it wasn't a clean win for either side. They favored a compromise, minor improvements to the road for safety, plus a zoning variance that would allow a small cluster of attached homes in a designated redevelopment pocket, not the wide swath the developer had initially proposed. It was a delicate balance intended to placate everyone. Some neighbors cheered, others felt it was a betrayal. The developer, displeased, threatened to withdraw his entire proposal and look for greener pastures where municipalities would accept his terms without fuss. The city, meanwhile, wanted a path forward that wouldn't tie their hands to endless litigation. It was the classic municipal tug-of-war, the developer, the residents, and the city each tugging for a different future. That's when an unexpected ally emerged, the local preservation society. They were a small nonprofit that usually focused on historic downtown buildings, not suburban cul-de-sacs, but when I presented them with the old subdivision plat showing original tree lines and an unbroken pattern of early 20th century street design, they saw value beyond nostalgia. Their director, an unassuming woman named Claire, joined our meetings and helped frame our cause in a larger civic context. "This isn't NIMBYism," she told a nervous reporter from the local paper. "It's stewardship." Her influence was subtle but real. The Preservation Society had contacts on the council and credibility with the public, and their support shifted the narrative away from a binary of growth versus stagnation and toward one of thoughtful, measured development. In the end, the negotiation settled into a pragmatic agreement that still felt like a victory to me. The city would perform the necessary maintenance and install the safety features we'd insisted on: speed tables, better signage, and a new tree preservation ordinance that protected mature specimens within a certain radius of the road. The developer would scale back dramatically, focusing his project on a different parcel that didn't touch our cul-de-sac and contributing to a community fund to improve sidewalks and utilities in the neighborhood if the homeowners approved it in a binding referendum. Crucially, the agreement included a clause that any future rezoning affecting our immediate area would require a supermajority homeowner vote, not just a city nod. That last provision was the linchpin. It preserved our collective agency in a way Maggie never could have imagined. When the dust settled and the first crews finally showed up, not to tear down but to repair, I felt something like relief and something like sorrow at once. The trees still stood, the porches remained, and the kids still raced bicycles past my workshop. We had won a meaningful bit of control over our future. But the whole episode left me changed. The city's involvement had revealed a truth I couldn't ignore: property and power are always negotiated, never absolute. Maggie had been a symptom of that truth, a personification of petty authority. The developer represented the other face of it, the impersonal, corporate appetite for growth. And me, I'd learned, was neither purely hero nor merely stubborn homeowner. I was a participant in a complex civic dance that required legal knowledge, social bonds, and the willingness to keep showing up. At night, as the new LED streetlights cast a clean, white glow down the lane and the sound of a distant jackhammer faded into the rhythm of crickets, I'd sit on my porch and think about how fragile community really is. It can be stitched back together, but it requires vigilance, compromise, and an occasional hard-fought battle. I had won battles and lost time and paid in more ways than one, but the neighborhood was still ours to tend. Little did I know, though, that this chapter, about roads, zoning, and civic power, was only the preface to the final reckoning. The last move in this long game wasn't going to be about asphalt or bylaws. It was going to be about who we are willing to forgive, who we choose to remember, and what kind of people we wanted to be when the dust finally settled. When the dust had finally settled and the war between me and the HOA was nothing more than a bitter memory lingering in the corners of our once toxic neighborhood, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly life had changed since that fateful night when I sold the road to the city. The battle that began with a simple blockade across my driveway had spiraled into something far bigger, a clash of wills, egos, power, and principle. Yet, here I was, standing on the other side of it all, not as a defeated man but as someone who had wrestled control from those who thought they could dictate my life. The HOA's power had been dismantled brick by brick, rule by rule, fine by fine, until what remained was a hollow shell of the oppressive body it once was. I didn't just win the war for myself, I had redefined freedom for every resident who had silently endured the HOA's iron grip for years. Their reign of intimidation was over, their smug smiles erased, their endless letters and threats filed away into history. What once was their weapon, the road, the driveway, the control of access, had turned into their undoing. And I, the man they underestimated, had become the architect of their downfall. The city's purchase of the road had been more than just a legal transaction, it was a turning point that shifted the balance of power permanently. The moment the paperwork was signed, the road became public property, and suddenly all those HOA restrictions, fees, and petty threats evaporated. No more fines for parking overnight, no more warnings for guests staying too long, no more HOA patrols driving around with clipboards, jotting down infractions. Instead, the city took responsibility for maintenance, plowing, and access. Residents were free to live without harassment, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood breathed. It was as though the chains had fallen away. What surprised me most was how quickly the other residents, who had once turned a blind eye or whispered about my rebellion, began to stand taller. Neighbors I had never spoken to before came over with handshakes and thank yous. Families who once feared retaliation began speaking openly about how much they hated the HOA's endless interference. And little by little, the power the HOA had wielded over us all disintegrated like dust in the wind. They had tried to crush me, but in their arrogance, they had given me the very motivation I needed to burn their empire down. But the aftermath was not just about victory, it was about rebuilding trust, community, and most importantly, myself. For months, I had lived under the constant pressure of confrontation. Every letter, every knock at my door, every threat left on my voicemail had chipped away at my peace of mind. Standing my ground had cost me sleep, time, and even strained some of my relationships. But as I looked around at the liberated neighborhood, I realized it had all been worth it. The quiet evenings, the laughter of kids riding their bikes down the very street the HOA once guarded like a fortress, the simple act of walking outside without fear of harassment, it all felt like rewards greater than any legal victory. And in those moments of calm, I began to see clearly, the real fight had never been about a driveway or a road. It had always been about freedom, about a man's right to live without someone else constantly dictating how he should live his life. And in standing up for myself, I had inadvertently become the voice for everyone else who had been too afraid to fight. Of course, the HOA board members didn't disappear quietly. For a while, they tried to salvage their pride, threatening lawsuits and muttering about illegal deals. They showed up at city council meetings, shouting about how I had destroyed the order of the neighborhood. But their words fell on deaf ears. The city officials backed me, the residents supported me, and their accusations carried no weight anymore. Without the road, without their control, they were nothing more than a group of bitter people clinging to a title that no longer meant anything. One by one, the board members resigned, and soon the HOA dissolved entirely. Their office was shut down, their files shredded, their bank account emptied to cover their debts. What was once a symbol of their dominance became nothing more than a cautionary tale. Their arrogance had blinded them, and their downfall was poetic justice. Looking back now, I don't just see a man who fought back against his HOA, I see a man who learned the true cost of freedom. I see a story that began with frustration but ended with triumph. And I see a community that now thrives because one person refused to be bullied into submission. If you had told me years ago that a simple blockade in front of my driveway would set into motion a series of events that would forever change the landscape of our neighborhood, I wouldn't have believed you. But that's the strange thing about life, sometimes the smallest spark lights the biggest fire. And for me, that fire burned away the lies, the corruption, and the tyranny that had ruled over us for too long. Now, every time I drive down that road, I smile. Not because I own it, but because it belongs to everyone. The road, once a weapon, is now a symbol. A symbol that no matter how strong the chains of control may seem, they can always be broken. And I, the man who sold the road to the city overnight, will never forget the lesson that came with it. Stand your ground, fight for what's right, and never let anyone block the path to your freedom.